Сейчас, секунду, я
Да,
проверю.
я включу, когда начну говорить, чтобы этот
Мгм.
весь, да, организационную часть не записывать.
Сейчас, секунду, я
Да,
проверю.
Да,
Так,
все,
стрим идет у нас.
все, отлично. Тогда я включаю запись, и мы с вами приступаем. Так, коллеги, здравствуйте. Я приветствую вас на очередной встрече проекта «Музейный клуб». И сегодня мы будем говорить о новой для нашего профессионального сообщества теме. Мы будем говорить о буллинге в музее. И делать мы это будем, обращаясь к опыту и такому теоретическому и практическому наших коллег из Великобритании. И отмечу, что для нас сегодня это первый опыт организации такого международного события, поэтому мы, конечно, немного волнуемся. И сейчас... Я с удовольствием представлю тех коллег, да, с кем мы сегодня работаем. Это Алекс Вудл, преподаватель университета Шеффилд. Мы познакомились с Алекс несколько лет назад, когда вместе писали диссертации в школе музейных исследований Лестера. И я очень рада, что сквозь года и расстояния мы можем так сегодня увидеться и узнать, как обстоят дела в Великобритании, в том числе с буллингом. Мы сегодня проводим эту встречу вместе с Алей Загитовой. Мы работаем уже тоже несколько лет и стараемся развивать тему благополучия в музеях. И разговор о буллинге продолжает тему. Мы уже говорили о благополучии, о стрессе, о выгорании. И надеюсь, что опыт наших британских коллег будет полезен. Потому что, повторюсь, тема новая для разговора именно публичного. И здорово, что мы начинаем это не на каком-то пустом месте, да, а обращаемся уже к исследованию, к результатам, к методике и можем говорить об этом предметно. Я благодарю ИКОМ России за поддержку информационную и техническую. И, конечно, наша встреча была бы невозможна без наших замечательных переводчиков. Это Татьяна Швец и Анастасия Лазаренко, которые уже активно работают с музейными проектами. Регулярно мы встречаем коллег на самых разных мероприятиях. Я очень рада, что сегодня Татьяна и Анастасия нашли возможность, чтобы поработать с нами и провести мероприятие. Аль, пожалуйста, скажи пару слов об организации, как мы собираем вопросы, и потом, пожалуйста, передай слово Алексу. Я пока свой микрофон включу.
Да, коллеги, здравствуйте. Аня, большое спасибо за представление. Вопросы мы будем собирать следующим образом. У нас сейчас идет прямая трансляция на канале «Идеи для музея» в YouTube. Вы можете оставлять свои, если вы смотрите трансляцию, то можете оставлять свои вопросы там. Мы отслеживаем их, и комментарии, и вопросы можем озвучить за вас в прямом эфире. Если вы хотите задать вопрос голосом, то вы можете написать в общий чат, который здесь видите в Zoom, и мы вам дадим возможность выйти в эфир и задать вопрос лично. Вопросы все тоже, вопросы и ответы все тоже переводятся, так что вы можете не волноваться за английский язык. И вы можете также задавать вопросы просто в чате, письменно, мы тоже их озвучим в эфире Александре после того, как она закончит свое выступление. Вот, кажется, я сказала обо всем. Вот, желаю нам всем удачи и передаю слово Александре.
Is it me now? Wonderful. Добрый вечер и большое спасибо. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I did learn to speak Russian at school, but very sadly, I haven't had the chance to practice, and I've actually sadly forgotten much of what I learned. So I'm really grateful to have translators for me this evening. It's the first time I've done a session which has been translated. Particular thanks to Ideas for Museums and to ICOM Russia, to Anna for getting in touch with me initially, and to Alia, Olga, Tatiana and Anastasia. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. And thank you for giving up your precious time in the evening to come along. I would also like to thank my colleague Tamsin Russell, who is the Workforce Development Officer at the UK Museums Association, for taking me up on my initial suggestion that this work really needed doing. As you may know, I'm a museums professional and a museum studies academic. My background is largely about working with objects, and particularly objects made by artists. So it's rather strange that I'm now in a university management school where I focus on workforce well-being and on bullying. And ironically, I am in this job on the basis of my own personal experience of being bullied in a professional leadership role in the museum sector in the UK. So some of what I'm going to say today is from a very personal perspective. So I just want to acknowledge that. I gave a very similar paper to this last week at the International Association on Workplace Bullying and Harassment. And I have to say that I didn't even know there was such an organisation until about a year ago. And I think it's really important that we talk about this issue, and that something we make steps to make changes in our organisations. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to talk about bullying in the UK museums sector. My Twitter details are there at Alex Woodall, if anyone is interested in connecting. So just an introduction to me. That's me in action in a museum doing what I enjoy doing best. But I've got quite a diverse professional background. And I think, though, the necessity of having a positive emotional experience while at work has been central across everything that I've done and that connects my career. So I'm currently the programme manager for a master's degree in creative and cultural industries management at the University of Sheffield. And I particularly lecture about museum management. And as I said before, arguably, I've ended up in this position because of my own experience of being bullied and wanting to do something about it and change things. Prior to this, I worked as a museum professional, mostly doing learning, interpretation and exhibitions work, and largely in the north of England. So for museums Sheffield, Manchester Art Gallery, the Royal Armouries in Leeds, the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts, which is actually in the east of England. And I've also worked as a freelance consultant. I studied at the University of Leicester for my PhD, which was about objects and creative engagement with objects. And I did my MA there as well. And it's through the PhD, I think Anna mentioned this, from the little Russian I can understand. I think she mentioned in the introduction that that's how we know each other. But originally, I trained as a secondary school teacher of philosophy and religious studies. And my first degrees were in theology. So I've got a really mixed career. But I think this sense of fairness and compassion at work are really, really important. So today I'm going to talk about a piece of research that I initiated back in 2018. And it then became a research project in 2019, and the report was published in 2020, or well, actually 21. So it's taken a few years to get to this stage. So in today's presentation, I'm going to first tell you a bit about some of the definitions that we used, because I think that's really important to understand. I'll talk about the background and the rationale for the project, the methods that we used to undertake this piece of research, and then the findings and some recommendations. I will also talk about some of the lessons that we learnt and the next steps for the project. So hopefully it will be a useful session and one that is quite reflexive, so you can perhaps relate things to your own practice and your own work in museums. So to start with some definitions, we actually discovered when doing this research that there had never been any research done about bullying in the UK museum sector. So it was quite hard to find a definition that really, there are lots of definitions of bullying, but to find one that was specific to our sector was not possible. But one of the books that we used was a piece of work by Anne-Marie Quigg, who wrote a book in 2017 called Bullying in the Arts, where she actually did some research across theatres and ballet and opera and different types of music, but she also included museums and art galleries within that. And her definition is that bullying is offensive, abusive, malicious, insulting, and or intimidating behaviour that occurs on more than one occasion. So that's the definition that we used for the majority of the time. And again, there's an organisation in the UK called ACAS, which is, I've forgotten what it stands for, I should know. But it's basically a workplace organisation where you can go to for support around issues that you have in the workplace. And their definition is very similar. So bullying may be characterised as offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour, and abuse or misuse of power. I think that's really important as well, because often our museums are very hierarchical and there are always different issues of power at play. And again, we have through means that undermine, humiliate, denigrate, or injure the recipient. So that's the definitions that we used to enable people to understand what it was that we were wanting to think about. In terms of the terminology, there are some key things. So one of the aspects is that bullying is a conscious act. Now, at the conference I went to last week, there was actually quite a bit of debate about this, and many academics suggest that in some cases it's an unconscious act. So perhaps we can, if you have questions, we can talk about that towards the end. But those other key things, it's sustained, so it's something that happens over a period of time. It's malevolent, so it's deliberately badly intended to hurt people, and it's detrimental to both, well, to the person who is being bullied, the target, both in terms of their health, their well-being, their psychological and emotional impact, and even things like their family life, and even job and finances and all of those sorts of things. So the word that we used for the person who's experienced bullying is a target, and the word that we used for the person who's doing the bullying or being accused of doing the bullying is the perpetrator. And we also, in our research, were really interested in the witnesses and whether a witness is complicit in bullying or whether a witness is actually also being bullied by virtue of just having witnessed some awful behaviour. So those are some definitions. You may have noticed that the title of the research is Sticks and Stones, and this comes from, this is an idiom from English language, from a poem which is for children, that says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And it's used as a sort of saying for children in the playground, used to kind of go against being called names in the playground. Personally, I think it's horrible because words do hurt. But that was the title of our piece of research. Obviously, no work sector is immune from bullying, but as I said earlier, there had been no research on this within museums, but there is a lot of research on bullying in the UK, particularly in large corporations, banks, healthcare settings, and things like the police force, firefighters, that sort of thing. There has been quite a lot of research. And of course, it connects really closely to workplace health and well-being. Okay, so the background to the project, just a small bit of background to the museum sector in the UK. So as largely public sector civic spaces, museums have a duty to provide a thriving and healthy workplace. Care is an absolutely central concept to museums. We have to care for our collections. We have to care for our audiences. But what seems to often be neglected is caring for our own staff, our own people. It's a highly competitive sector. The salaries are not good. There are very high expectations, and the entry-level criteria are extremely high as well. Thankfully, in the UK, this is now being challenged, and rather than having lots of degrees in order to work in a museum, people are valuing experience a lot more, it's a good thing. But we all know that lots of different skills are required, and certainly in the UK, the workforce is dominated by women, yet it is often men who have the directorships at the top. In the UK museum sector, health and well-being are high up on the priority list, and the role of museums in promoting and supporting social justice is a real strategic aim. So it seemed really ironic to me that museum workplaces could be such toxic environments to be in. But if we think about it a bit more deeply, maybe this isn't the case, because museums are really problematic in that they're entrenched in colonial legacies of empire and difficult histories of white or European supremacy, of theft, plunder, looting, and racism. And quite rightly, the very institution of museums is currently being investigated and challenged and rethought through co-creative and democratic audience-focused work. So there's a renewed focus on delivering social justice, anti-racism, and decoloniality. For example, at the moment in the UK, there's a lot of work around restitution of objects to their countries of origin. What I'm talking about today took place pre-COVID, largely, but obviously the pandemic has been a massive crisis for the sector. So most museums have been closed for a year, losing income and staff. So it's been very devastating, and I think it will be really interesting to see what the impact that this year has had on bullying as well. In terms of my personal experience, I've already mentioned that I basically had a terrible experience in a job. It should have been my dream job. I moved house halfway across the country to this, what I thought was going to be a lovely job, and it was not lovely at all. It was toxic. I became very ill, and I also became very angry while I was ill because it didn't feel fair that this was happening. I was a member of a trade union. I don't know if it's similar in Russia, maybe not. But certainly in the UK, union membership in museums is not widespread at all. And I found that while I was ill, I was also having to find out about how to deal with a grievance and how to sort things out myself. So one of the things that I really wanted to do was to go to the Museums Association, make them aware that this was a big issue, because I also knew anecdotally that many of my friends and colleagues were facing similar issues. And it felt like a duty to actually make change and try and do something. So luckily, the Museums Association were really receptive to this idea. They are the UK membership organisation for museums, and so they actively campaign for a more representative workforce, and they support museums across all 4 nations of the UK. And their mission is about inspiring museums to change lives, and they oversee the Code of Ethics for UK museums. So to have their buy-in to this project was really, really important. So it kind of emerged from a personal sense of injustice, but also the need to make radical systemic change. Okay, so I'll now talk through the aims. Initially, my idea was just that we needed a place that could signpost information and provide advice online. So through the Museums Association website, if there was just one page that had some telephone numbers, some websites to go to if you were personally being bullied, that would be a great first step. Just to know that there are places that you can go, and that there are other people in a similar situation. But I thought it was also important to explore and acknowledge that bullying was a thing in the museum sector, because we knew so many people who'd experienced really awful times at work that something needed to be done. And in order to acknowledge it, we had to undertake some preliminary research to get the data together. And then, of course, the aim was to publish and disseminate the research findings like I'm doing now, and to develop some recommendations and further actions. So how did we do this? Well, I worked together with Tamsin to develop a preliminary survey, which we advertised through the Museums Association newsletter, but also on Twitter and other social media. And the survey had 3 parts. The first part was about people's own lived experience, so if they had ever been bullied, and asking questions about that. The second section was around whether people had observed others bullying their colleagues. And the third section was about profiling, so some demographic information and that sort of thing. And the survey itself had these 3 parts, but some of it was multiple choice questions and some of it was free text where people could write narratives. The results, therefore, were both quantitative and qualitative. And I'll come on to this at the end when I talk about the lessons learned, because we learned a lot about how not to write a survey from doing this as well. So if any of you are thinking of doing something similar in Russia, I can give you lots of advice about how to change what we did and make it better next time. We identified 21 characteristics of bullying, which I have a slide about in a minute. The actual survey was online between November and December 2019. There's an event called Anti-Bullying Week, which happens in November, and we launched it then. And there was a task and finish group. So myself and my colleague Tamsin worked together with 2 other colleagues, one who was a representative from HR, Human Resources, in the museum sector, and one person who worked for a trade union. So we regularly met to discuss the project. So I'm just going to go through what we asked in this questionnaire. So the first question was that we're interested in your personal experience of bullying. So this was a chance for people to write whatever they wanted to about their experiences, ideally not using language that would identify people. And we suggested there a maximum word count of 200 words. However, people wrote a lot more than that. And I'll talk about this when I come on to the findings. So that was the first question, just to write your own experiences. After that, we then had some multiple choice questions. So people could decide, could write down whether the perpetrator was a colleague at the same level, or their line manager, more senior than the line manager, or whether it was a subordinate or a volunteer, or someone else like a client or a freelance associate. So those were questions that we asked. Then we asked how long the experience of bullying lasted for. Was it less than 3 months, or whether it was still ongoing? So we had all these different time categories. This is the 21 characteristics of bullying. I probably don't need to read through all of them, unless it might be useful for the translation. So the first one is a lack of responsiveness. So, for example, not responding to emails, questions, or phone calls, which you may not even think is bullying. So that's the interesting thing about this list. Many of these things may happen on a regular basis, but not necessarily badly enough that you think it is actually considered bullying. Aggressive behaviour, for example, shouting, swearing, or intruding on personal space. Allocation of unfair workload, or constantly changing priorities. Blame, for example, being used as a scapegoat or the reason for poor quality work. Controlling contact with other colleagues, critical comments and micromanagement, cyberbullying, direct harassment based on protected characteristics. So that means protected characteristics, I don't know if it's the same in Russia, but that's around things like ethnicity, disability, gender. Then we have limiting access to essential information, limiting opportunities for training, minimization of role, name calling and unwanted jokes, persistent unreasonable communication outside working hours, physical intrusion into space, removal of responsibility, taking credit for work or actions, threats or comments relating to job security, and undermining in public and private by spreading rumours. So you can see it's a long list, and many of the things on there may seem quite small and things that you just turn a blind eye to or think, oh, well, that person's having a bad day or something like that. But actually, when you begin to see this list and realise that many of the things might be happening at the same time, it really kind of makes it apparent that what bullying can be. So the next question we asked was, what action did you take? And we gave various options there. So did you raise it with your line manager or your senior line manager? Did you talk to a colleague? Did you talk to human resources or your trade union? Did you raise a formal grievance? So was there a process to follow in your organisation? Did you need mediation, so someone to act and sit in the room with you and the perpetrator? Did you take external advice just from your friends or from other places? Did you raise it with other freelancers or other organisations, or none was one of the options? And we'll come back to that later on. We also asked about the most significant impact of the experience of bullying. So did it impact your health, physically or psychologically, your work performance, your non-work life, including your family, or your reputation and ability to earn? And then we asked, how was your experience of bullying resolved? And the top one there, you can see it wasn't, and it still continues. There are also several other things. The perpetrator was moved, sanctions were applied, etc., etc. Sanctions were applied to me is one of them, or I was moved. And then there are, it wasn't resolved and the perpetrator left, or you as the victim of being bullied decided to leave the organisation, or in some cases you left the whole museum sector as a result of this awful experience. And then we asked if people were satisfied with the outcome, yes or no. And we asked people to say what they think should have been done differently, if anything. So what were the findings from all of this research? Well, we had 510 responses in a period of about 6 weeks, and that is the highest ever rate for a Museums Association survey, which I think speaks volumes. The types of answers that we got were very representative of the workforce in the UK. So this is from the questions that we asked in section 3. So the average, if you can say that, the average respondent was a white, atheist, heterosexual female aged between 35 to 44, mid-career, with about 10 to 20 years of experience, no disability, but who has seen bullying increase during their career. 39% of people felt bullying had increased. And really interestingly, the most likely person to be the bully was a direct line manager. And you can see there some of the common bullying behaviours about minimising people's contributions, limiting access to information, being overly critical of work, and micromanagement, including things like spreading rumours. 25% of respondents thought they were being bullied as a direct result of a protected characteristic. So gender was the most significant. People also mentioned their social class or their position in the hierarchy of the organisation. And there were lots of findings around maternity. So when people went on maternity leave to have a baby, then there were often issues with returning to work. Of course, bullying had negative impacts in all of these different areas. We knew that, but it was good to actually now have some data to prove this. And generally, people didn't really know about any formal policies and procedures. So that's just an overview, but I'll just show you some of the key findings, because it's really shocking. You can see here that the most common perpetrator is a direct line manager or someone more senior. So we had about over 300 respondents out of the 500. It was someone more senior than them who was the perpetrator. For most people, the experience lasted over 9 months or was still ongoing. So it's something that's a long-term issue. And then we asked people to look at that list of 21 behaviours and tick all of the ones that they experienced during the time. And you can see that people are experiencing an awful lot of different things at the same time. Interestingly, the least common was cyberbullying, but I think were we to do this survey again now, after a year of working online, this may be slightly different and perhaps may have increased a bit. Additional bullying behaviours, this is just what some people wrote in the narrative section, so so when they had a free text answer. So we had things like falsified appraisal content and fake signatures, reading people's emails, use of derogatory body and facial gestures, not allowed the same amount of holiday as others, denied full maternity leave, comments like, "I am your director, you will do what I say," threats to report people to the board of trustees, threats of redundancy, people being spied on with CCTV, sharing pictures of victims on social media without their consent. In one case, this is absolutely horrendous. Someone had left a noose with a disjointed figure left hanging at someone's desk. And then things like requests for after-work meetups or calling while drunk out of hours, which may, again, not necessarily seem like bullying, but when you've got all of this stuff happening at the same time, it certainly is. We've then got the findings here for what action you took, and you can see there that most people, their first reaction was to talk to a colleague first before their line manager, because obviously the line manager is often the main perpetrator. Also, taking external advice is really strong there. So people go to their friends and family first before they confront it with anyone. And again, so you can see there's a sort of a range of responses there, but taking it higher, going to the senior line manager, not lots of people did. So that's interesting results there. These are just the numbers of responses that we got to the significant impacts of bullying. So you can see there that the majority of people had really psychological impact through this behaviour. But also all of those other things featured. So people were impacted in terms of their reputation and ability to earn, as well as performance and family life and so on. Now, this is, to me, really shocking. How was your experience of bullying resolved? And the number one there is that it wasn't, and I left or stopped working with the organisation. And I think that's really key for our sector, because we are losing really brilliant, good people because of this disgusting behaviour. And we really need to address this because we cannot have a drain on a sector which already is being drained for lots of other reasons. So we don't want to lose our good, brilliant staff. And you can see that some people raised a grievance. Some people say that the bullying wasn't resolved and it still continues. And some people have left the sector, etc. So in most cases, the experience wasn't resolved. And then this is the real shocker. Were you satisfied with the outcome? No, 90% of people were not satisfied with what happened when they reported or spoke about the bullying. So we need to do something. And that's what I'm currently working with the Museums Association on thinking about. Just in terms of protected characteristics, you can see here the percentages. So we had 44% of people who were bullied because of their gender. And you can see those other numbers: 27% because of age, 19% because of disability, 9% for race or ethnic origin, 7% due to parental responsibilities or maternity, 2% for religion, 2% for sexual orientation, and 1% for gender reassignment. So this begins to bring bullying together with harassment and those legal responsibilities as well. And again, here you can just see some of the statistics about the impact. So 95% of people had psychological impact, which included being signed off work, lacking self-esteem, being depressed, anxious, having panic attacks, being frightened, etc., and even consideration of suicide as an extreme impact. So recommendations in the report, we asked, well, in the survey, we asked our respondents what their suggestions would be as to how to make improvements. 78% of people thought every organisation should ensure that good practice is covered in training, particularly for management and leadership programmes, as well as during the induction when you start working for an organisation. 72% felt that organisations had to have a bullying policy and a procedure that staff knew about. And 66% of respondents felt it was important to ensure people had an awareness of the impacts of bullying and the need to signpost support where possible. Only 37% of respondents' organisations had a bullying policy, which was interesting. So we put together some recommendations for the sector, for line managers, for targets, for colleagues, and also for perpetrators. I won't read through all of these because there are lots of them, but basically the key thing that we recommend for organisations was to develop and adhere to a policy for bullying, but make sure that that policy is a living document. So it doesn't just sit on a shelf in a folder, but it actually gets used and gets changed regularly and looked at and explored. We also said that it was really important to ensure that the organisation had a zero tolerance approach to bullying. Things around transparency are really important as well, and making sure that there's an anti-bullying programme. So what can you do to coach staff or to provide resources, to provide surveys regularly for staff to see if there are any trends? Is there a team where people are often leaving, or where staff in a particular team are often absent due to illness? Things like that. What can be done? Making sure that that there's other opportunities for support and networks. And one thing that came out was this idea of a mental health first aider. So someone in your organisation who is neutral but can offer mental health support, not a counsellor, but someone who's had particular training on listening. In terms of recommendations for line managers, basically the key for this was about being a role model for professional behaviour and making sure that you're open and visible to people within your team and know how those policies about bullying work. And things around making sure that managers participate in relevant training and that you have a team culture of working together and of collaboration, and challenge bullying behaviour, even if it's something that you think might be quite small, but to challenge it when it occurs is important behaviour for a manager. And the final one on here is about regularly getting opportunities on your own management style. So if you're a manager, asking your team what you're like as a manager, getting 360 feedback. So that means when you ask everyone that you work with for some feedback on your approach as a manager. Then we put together some recommendations for targets. And the key one of these obviously is, well, to talk to people is the most important one, but also to make sure you gather notes, including if there are any witnesses. But if you just keep details of things that are happening, and make sure you keep a copy of those documents. But above all, talking to people is absolutely essential, and not going through this on your own. And again, recommendations for colleagues are quite similar to some of the management ones. So challenge the behaviour if you see it, making sure that you're aware about the policies, and offer support if you have a colleague or a friend in need. We also, this was a bit controversial, but we gave some recommendations for perpetrators and potential perpetrators. Now, nobody wants to be known as a perpetrator of bullying. So this really is training for everyone, because even if you don't think of yourself as a bully, maybe one day someone else may think you are. So it's just important to be aware of your own behaviour and the impact of your own behaviour on staff. So that was our recommendations. The report is here, Sticks and Stones, and also the Museums Association has something called the Wellbeing Hub, which provides lots of workforce advice and support for other things as well. So at the moment, for example, they are providing lots of advice on how to go back to work following COVID, and where people have been, their museums have been closed for a year, which may have been really stressful and difficult. So what lessons did we learn? How am I doing? Oh, I've gone over time. I'll be quite quick. So lessons learnt. One of the key lessons learnt was around having an ethics statement for the research. So at the time of doing this research, I was a freelance museum consultant. So it was before I got my job at Sheffield University. And in hindsight, Tamsin and I made a bit of a mistake, which was that we prioritised the confidentiality of participants over our own researcher well-being. So basically, in our ethics statement, we said to the participants that it would only be myself and Tamsin, my colleague, who would have access to all this data. We had no idea that 510 people would reply. And it became, to be honest, a complete nightmare, because we had so much data and neither of us were particular experts, particularly in quantitative analysis. So that was one of the key lessons learned. We would definitely change the ethics statement and allow more access to more people to help with the research. The ownership of the research was pretty difficult as well, because I started the project as a freelance consultant, but then I got my job at Sheffield, and basically it meant that the project became much more a Museums Association thing than something that I was involved in. So again, important, just a lesson learned about project management, really, to do with that one. Buy-in from key organisations. The Museums Association have been amazing, but my colleague there even struggled to get this project seen as a priority, because obviously there was reticence to do the research, because if the Museums Association acknowledged this is a problem, it would be damaging to the entire sector, and it could have implications with regard to museum funding. So that was a really difficult thing to negotiate. In terms of analysis of data, we had too much. So at the moment, I said that we'd done 3 sections for the survey. So people's own experiences, and then if they'd witnessed bullying, we asked for that. But so we haven't even looked at that detail yet. There's been so much. We had 178 lines of data in a big spreadsheet, and we had about 40,000 words of narrative content, which was really difficult and harrowing to read. And remember, it was just myself and Tamsin reading it all. And both of us had had difficult situations at work, so that made it even worse. The research kind of was accidental in that my research, as I said, is usually about objects and working with artists and nice, happy things that happen in museums. So it kind of was a bit accidental that I've ended up researching this pretty depressing subject as well. And I'm obviously not an expert in the background literature on bullying, although I am quickly becoming more expert, but I didn't know anything about the sort of academic literature at the start. And researcher well-being, really, really key, as I've said. It was naive of me to think I could do the research without reliving some of the awful experiences I'd had. And I think if you're thinking of looking into this, remember to look after yourself as well is a really key thing. Just quickly in terms of next steps. So workforce well-being has been identified as a priority for the sector, which is great. We're continuing to do advocacy and get support for the research. And at the moment, we're disseminating the findings to DCMS, which is the Government Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and Arts Council England. Now, again, like I said with the senior colleagues at the Museums Association, of course, there's a slight danger in sharing the research with them because of funding and political reasons. So we're being quite careful about that, but I think it's important. We're also comparing the findings with other sectors and doing training, and there will be some academic publications as well. So that's everything that I wanted to say. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to the screen. Hopefully people are still there and not fallen asleep. And hopefully there are some questions.
Да. Александра, меня слышно сейчас, да? Огромное спасибо, Александра, за рассказ. Впечатляет, и я согласна с тем, что работа с такими данными, с этими историями, она требует выдержки, и тоже нужно думать о собственном благополучии, о собственной сохранности, о том, как потом успокаивать себя и, в общем, приходить в чувство после всего этого. Пока коллеги думают над вопросами, я задам первый вопрос. Вы сказали, что это исследование вы делали вдвоем с коллегой. Думали ли вы о том, чтобы привлекать к исследованию психологов? Так. Татьяна, получилось ли перевести вопрос?
Перевод был, но, похоже, Алекс не слышит. Давай в чат ей напишем здесь в общий, может быть, она так увидит.
Угу. Я его сокращу. Да, Александра, скажите, думали ли вы о том, чтобы привлекать к тому исследованию, которое прошло уже, и к вашим следующим шагам независимых психологов?
Sorry, I've only just realized how I can hear you. Can do the translation into English. Apologies. Please, could you translate that again?
Да, мне еще раз повторить вопрос, да? Думали ли вы, Александра, спасибо огромное за выступление, очень полезно и впечатляюще. Думали ли вы о том, чтобы подключить к следующим шагам независимых психологов?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And actually, in the department where I now work in Sheffield, we have one of my groups of colleagues are work psychologists, and they're really interested in this research. So we've been doing some initial work with the work psychologists and also with academics whose focus is on organizational studies and the kind of psychology of organizations. So yeah, definitely. Great question. Thank you.
Спасибо. Я зачитаю вопросы из нашего чата. Спрашивает Мария, как вы думаете, Александра, чем отличается буллинг в музее от буллинга в любой другой корпорации? И есть ли специфика?
Good question. I don't know. And I don't know if there is a difference. And hopefully the next stage of the research will be able to look at this and compare a little bit. I think some of my comments at the start around the very kind of history of the origins of museums in themselves and some of the problems of museums and their connection to colonialism and to empire and all of those quite difficult histories. Maybe that might be a difference, but I suspect probably not. But I guess it's a sector where people tend to be very passionate about what they do, and maybe there's something there about people being exploited because they love. Ideally, they would want to love their job, and so they tend to work extra hours and do things, work really, really hard. And this might be a way that people can take advantage of museum staff. But I don't know, and I'm really interested to find out more.
Спасибо. Еще один вопрос из чата. В чем вы видите причины такой сложной ситуации в музеях Великобритании? Ситуации с буллингом имеется в виду.
Again, it's a very under-researched area. My own feeling, but without rigorous data, is that often managers are not trained how to be managers. They're not trained in people skills and in things like conflict resolution and in how to get the best out of people and how to be compassionate and how to lead through having a shared set of values. And I think this is a problem. So if managers were better equipped and trained around some of those things, maybe the situation would be easier. But again, there's not enough research at all yet, so hopefully we'll be able to discover more.
Спасибо. Я задам еще один вопрос из вкладки «Вопросы и ответы», а потом у нас есть участники, которые хотят задать вопрос голосом. Вас благодарят за доклад и спрашивают, о механизмах самозащиты. Как помочь себе самому, если в организации принята иерархия, как в армии, и буллинг не обсуждается? Можете ли вы посоветовать литературу или что-то из своей практики? Как быть?
Yeah. I wish I could give a really simple, easy answer, but in terms of looking after yourself, the absolute key is to talk to people, whether it's people who are totally separate from the organization, if that's an easier place to start with, just your family and friends, and then perhaps a colleague that you trust first. But I think self-preservation is really important. There's a lot of work that I've only discovered recently, now I've been in my post at Sheffield, around, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, around conflict resolution and how to stop things escalating. And I think that's really interesting. And there's quite a bit of research about evaluating how kind of interventions can benefit. So basically making sure that you do something before it gets to a really critical stage, making sure there's someone who's neutral or someone who you can go to and who could act as a mediator between yourself and the person in the hierarchy. But again, it's really difficult, and I wish we knew. There are some useful books and texts around bullying in the workplace, and one of my colleagues in Sheffield runs something called Propel Hub, which I can share. I don't know if I can type in the details while I'm talking, but they run sort of some training sessions about those kind of interventions, which have been really useful. And I don't see why people from Russia couldn't come along, except we don't have brilliant translators though.
Спасибо. Спасибо. У нас еще один вопрос из чата. Поменялась ли как-то ситуация с буллингом в музеях после вашего исследования?
Not yet. No. Because the publication came out fairly recently during the COVID pandemic, so we haven't obviously been able to do, you know, face-to-face interventions, and museums have been closed and all of those sorts of things, but it is firmly on the agenda, and we're, you know, doing events like this and things within the UK to try and just make people aware about it and make sure that we keep going and hopefully make some changes. And the more we talk about it, the more difficult it is for bullies to hide. So I think it's important to talk.
Спасибо. Еще вопрос. Понимаете ли вы, есть ли понимание, как отличать буллинг от профессиональных конфликтов, которые естественны для любой организации?
Yeah. That's a really difficult question. And I think one of the things that we were keen, that's why we had a definition of bullying, which we shared with participants in the survey, because of course conflict happens at work, you know, all the time. You may disagree with your manager, but it doesn't necessarily end up as a persistent thing. And it might not necessarily be malicious. So the key terms that we used for the definition of bullying are, I think they're quite helpful, because it's about the kind of ongoing, even if it's little things, but if they keep happening and if they're having an impact on you, then that's when it may become bullying. But I agree, it's really difficult to define. And you know, that what's one person defines as bullying, the bully might not define as bullying. Yeah.
Спасибо. Вот еще у нас интересный вопрос. В вашем исследовании удалось понять частотность, сейчас я сформулирую как-то правильно, с какой частотой в вашем исследовании руководители музеев являются агрессорами, инициаторами буллинга?
Well, from our data, most of the findings were that it was generally people, senior managers and leaders who were the bullies. Obviously, the research, it's only 510 people's responses, and I forgot, I should know the answer. I've forgotten the number of people who work across the whole sector in the UK. But I think it's a reasonable, 510 it's a reasonable percentage of people. I don't know if Anna might know the answer to that more than I do, maybe. Yeah, so far it would seem that line managers do tend to be in that position. But again, we need to do more research, because this is just one small snapshot, really.
Спасибо. Еще один вопрос. Вас благодарят за такое значительное исследование и значимое. Как вы думаете, можно ли нормализовать отношения в коллективе после того, как произошел буллинг? И дальше коллега рассказывает историю о том, что был буллинг со стороны руководителя по отношению к одному из сотрудников. В конфликт был втянут весь коллектив, и большая часть сотрудников стала на сторону руководителя, но были и те, кто занял сторону сотрудника. Директор уволился, но конфликт остался, коллектив раскололся. Знаете ли вы механизмы преодоления такого рода конфликтов?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I suppose some of the work that's happening around conflict resolution, I think there are probably academics and practitioners who know more about this than I do at the moment. And I know one thing that I learned at the conference that I spoke at last week was that people there who worked in the area of conflict resolution were saying that actually they've been doing interventions into bullying for years, for 10, 20 years. But what hasn't happened is much evaluation of the effectiveness of that work. So actually there isn't very much data. It's a really surprise. It was surprising to me to be at a conference full of kind of bullying research experts, but hear them say that there is no research on the effectiveness of different interventions. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, I think, around the world. It was largely people from English-speaking countries, I probably, but there were lots of people from Australia and New Zealand at this conference in particular, who I think in general have done a lot more of this sort of research than maybe we have in Europe. But yeah, it's a gap. There's a gap in the study. So if anyone wants to become an expert in a new field of research, then there's something you could do there.
Спасибо. У нас еще один вопрос. В университетской среде, в которой вы работаете, есть ли такие проблемы с буллингом?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very similar. And I think in universities, there are lots of similarities between universities and how they operate and museums. And of course, we also have university museums, which are kind of the double, get both ends of the issue. But I think one of the problems in universities, and I can only speak for the UK, is that people who get leadership positions in universities, it tends to be a role rather than an actual job that you apply for. So, for example, to get a leadership position, it would be for a time period. So you may be head of a department for 3 years, and then you move on and do something else. And because of that, there isn't really an expectation that those heads of department will be trained in anything to do with people skills and people management. And I think this causes a climate of real toxicity in the university sector. And of course, because our universities here are becoming more like businesses as well, where, you know, students pay and they expect certain things for their money. So it's basically marketizing education. And I think all of these things lead to a really problematic culture. Yeah, definitely.
Спасибо большое. У нас есть еще вопрос. Нужно ли вывести коллегу в эфир? Сейчас мы поймем это.
Я спросила в чате, нет ответа.
Угу. Да, пока с этим вопросом мы подождем. У меня есть вопрос, Александра. Я вас слушаю. И,
Okay, thank you.
у меня сразу много вопросов. Часть из них перекликается с ситуациями, про которые нам рассказывают коллеги из российских музеев. И вот когда мы проводили небольшой опрос, нельзя назвать исследованием, о музейном стрессе у нас, в российских музеях, встал вопрос о том, что музеям нужен психолог. Как вы считаете, нужен ли музеям психолог? Такой штатный психолог.
Well, that's really interesting. So are you saying in your survey, museum staff wanted to have a psychologist actually working with the museum? I think. Yeah, what a great idea.
Ну, скорее, это у нас не было не исследование, да, скорее было такое предположение и предложение. Почему бы не сделать так, чтобы в музее был психолог?
I think that would be a really good idea. I think certainly access to that sort of support, counselling, or some kind of help well-being advisory type post, or a psychologist. But yeah, I think it's really important to either have a signpost within your workplace that tells you where you can go to get that sort of help, or even better, if the organization actually wants to employ a counsellor, that would be amazing. I know a lot of schools and of course universities, we have psychologists and counsellors working, you know, within those organizations. And actually you've made me think of something really interesting, which is that we do so much work with our communities and with our audiences around well-being and making sure that our participants are using the museum collections, for example, to have positive mental well-being and experiences. But actually, we don't, and we as staff, particularly if we might work in museum education, for example, we're running these well-being sessions. If we were counselors or psychologists. We would have regular support ourselves, so we would have supervision from another counsellor. But in our museum sector, we don't have that support, so we don't have a kind of anywhere to go to, you know, if we're at work and something difficult happens. I'm not talking about with staff, I'm not talking about bullying here, I'm talking about with our audiences. Say somebody comes to our museum and has a crisis in the museum, and we're the member of staff who has to deal with that problem. Who do we tell? Who do we go to for support if it's been a really upsetting situation? So yeah, I think anything like that is a great idea.
А как вы думаете, может ли это создать еще большие проблемы, если внутри коллектива проблемы уже есть, и кто-то увидит, что коллеги ходят к психологу? Может ли быть здесь какой-то источник проблем?
Oh, ask that one again. Let me think. Could you repeat the question?
Да, я сейчас повторю вопрос. Может ли такое наличие психолога в штате музея создать дополнительные проблемы, если есть конфликты, и сотрудники видят, что другие сотрудники ходят к психологу и будут думать, что они жалуются, например? Не может ли это обострить буллинг?
Oh, well, possibly. So I think all the appropriate measures would need to be in place to make sure that it was a private session and there was somewhere safe for it to happen, perhaps off-site or, you know, somewhere else. Yeah, that's a good point, and would definitely need considering.
Да, сейчас у нас есть вопрос.
Подожди, пожалуйста, ответила коллега, я не знаю, наверное, это Виктория, как вас зовут. Я сейчас вас вывожу в эфир. Я сделаю вас сейчас соорганизатором. Это даст вам возможность включить камеру. Пожалуйста, вы можете присоединиться к нам. Пожалуйста, представьтесь. У вас пока... Он, видимо, говорит по-английски, что ли? Да?
I can't hear, unfortunately.
Тоже Алекс услышала, да?
I can't hear.
Если вы нас слышите, Виктор, наверное, Виктор, мы вас не слышим. Мы вас видим, мы видим, что вы говорите, но почему-то микрофон у вас не работает.
Do I switch off the English?
Сейчас работает.
Yeah, all right. If you do hear me, Alexandra, you made a perfect presentation.
Thank you.
And it raises a number of questions, of course, and it's very useful for all of us. But actually, museums are a very vicious place because they're closed ones. They're mostly competitive in terms of people who get there for tenure and stay long. That means that the stakes are very high, though the salaries may be very low. And that is having an impact on psychological tension between colleagues, which are responsive for themselves rather than cooperatives in terms of making a real teamwork. So perhaps to stop bullying, there's an effort to be made for teamwork between the colleagues and mutual understanding and benevolence, rather than, and that can be done only in one case. If you are benevolent for the audiences, if you do not work for yourselves and for the museum as a temple, but you work for the people, and then you have a service. Do you agree with this position of trying to revert the aims of museum work in any type of museum for a common benefit for the well-being of the people who want to come, for sharing your lives with them, rather than fighting yourselves for privileges and for self-esteem. That is the essence of a bully who is in the museum, entrenched, and will ever be if we don't cut this vile atmosphere of closed conservative teen. I'm a museum worker in the Academy of Sciences in Moscow for decades, and I know what it means, because in the best case, you're neglected. And that is, of course, a kind of bullying that you can't complain about. If you are not noticed and not esteemed by the colleagues, that is another type of bullying that maybe it would be nice to investigate about. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, and I wish you success.
Thank you for your comment. I totally agree that, you know, more emphasis needs to be placed on teamwork, cooperation, and having a shared set of values. And yeah, absolutely working for our audiences. That's why we do what we do.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Александр. У нас есть еще вопрос. Как вы думаете, эффективно ли в случае буллинга обращаться в профсоюз или в комиссию по разрешению трудовых споров?
That's a good question, and I don't know whether the Russian context might be slightly different here from the UK context, but certainly anecdotally, of the colleagues and friends that I know who are members of a trade union, it's very effective, because the whole idea is around the collective voice. So rather than being one individual making a complaint about bullying, actually you've got the support of a collective of people who want better workplaces, and for that reason I think it's effective. So for example, I don't know whether you know that probably about, I don't know, 5 years ago there was a big controversy at the National Gallery in London, where a lot of members of the education department lost their jobs. They were made redundant. But the unions were really heavily involved in that, and they were able to kind of protest and do various things, and it was really effective. So I think union membership is definitely positive, but as I said before, there is not one union for museum people, and I would probably say that the majority of museum staff are not members of a union at all. Because people might not know what a union does and that there even is a union. So where they are effective is where lots of people are members together. But yeah, it's really difficult when there is no museum union.
Спасибо. У меня есть еще, по-моему, у нас пока нет других вопросов. У меня есть свой. Да.
Есть один,
Есть,
но он
да?
как-то выходит, по-моему, за рамки разговора.
вижу.
Посмотри, пожалуйста.
Мгм. Я задам его чуть позже. Михаил, мы видим ваш вопрос. Чуть позже мы его зададим тогда. А у меня вопрос вот какой. Столкнулись ли вы как изменилось отношение к вам, ваших коллег, когда вы начали свое исследование? Было ли какое-то сопротивление среди музейных коллег опросам или теме?
That's a good question. question. Well, I think there were some people who, the organisation that I left because it was horrendous, part of me wanted to do this research, and for them to know. I obviously haven't said anything, and I've never named that organisation in anything that I've done, but I know that they know that I'm doing this piece of work, and personally, and possibly a little bit selfishly, I'm quite pleased about that. But in terms of other people and the wider museum sector, yeah, people have been really, really supportive and really pleased that we've done this research and that it's given people the opportunity to have a voice and to share things that sometimes they haven't spoken about for 10 years or a long time. So yeah, absolutely, it's been really very much appreciated by the sector, and we've had lots of comments and we've had some criticisms as well because of the because people are scared that this might unleash all sorts of terrible things, and we don't want politicians looking at museums as being something that they shouldn't be funding, for example. But yeah, it's been, I'm really proud to have been part of it and to have started something that hopefully will continue and hopefully will make some changes.
Спасибо. Да, это правда. Спасибо вам огромное. Мы восхищаемся вашим исследованием и берем с вас пример. Вы сказали в своем выступлении о том, что важно развивать корпоративную культуру, и это должно начинаться в музее с руководителей. Есть ли в этом направлении какие-то изменения? Как руководители музеев развивают корпоративную культуру в Великобритании, в великобританских музеях? Британских.
Wow, there are some museums doing amazing work on all sorts of values-based projects. So I would particularly recommend having a look at the work that Manchester Museum is doing at the moment. So they have a director who is a woman, and she comes from a museum education background as well. And that's quite rare to have a director who comes from that background rather than a curatorial background, for example. Her name is Esme Ward, and she has a very amazing singular vision for the museum, that it will become the most imaginative, caring and inclusive museum in the world. So imaginative, caring, inclusive. And so all of the work that they are doing is to support those three aims. And they just have some very simple strategies for making a positive work environment. For example, a lot of their meetings are walking meetings. So instead of sitting in an office for an hour, they'll go for a walk with their colleague instead and have ideas while they're walking. They even have a dog that is looked after by one member of staff, but it's a dog that anyone can borrow and kind of look after the dog as a way of escaping from the office for a bit. So they do some lovely, really simple, easy things, but also they're doing some amazing work in terms of working with communities around the world and repatriating objects back to Australia and to Africa and things like that. But they just have a really amazing positive vision. There's also a museum which hasn't opened yet, but it opens in May the 22nd, I think, in a month. called the Museum of Making, which is in Derby, which is in the Midlands in the UK. Derby is spelled D-E-R-B-Y. And that museum has been totally made with the community and with artists. So it's called the Museum of Making. So it's about making things and Derby's history of making. But it's the whole display and everything about it has been co-produced and co-created with audiences. And I think that has a real impact on how the staff work, because the staff, their number one priority is valuing their audiences. And I think because of that, they have a really high sense of valuing people and respecting people and compassion. So those are two places that I would have a look at. Yeah.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое. У меня еще есть один вопрос. Как вы думаете, нужно ли вносить изменения в Кодекс этики и ком Международного совета музеев в части буллинга и вообще внутримузейной культуры общения?
Really great question. I absolutely think that the Code of Ethics does need to have something in it about how we operate as organizations and as civilized, compassionate people. And I've forgotten where we are with the debates, with the ICOM debate, because it's been so contentious. But I can't remember whether the last version with I think having, polyphonic voices and all of those ideas are really, really important. But yeah, I think absolutely having something within it that mentions just it's about being nice and being civil to people. It's really important. And one of the things, so we have the UK, the Code of Ethics that the UK Museums Association oversees, which obviously is closely tied to the ICOM one. But at the moment, there are sort of statements that you can connect with bullying, but I think it probably should be made a bit more explicit about having caring workforces. And a museum is a caring space. It cares for objects, it cares for audiences, so it should, by definition, also care for its people. So yeah, good question.
Спасибо большое за ответ. Коллеги, есть ли еще у кого-то вопросы?
Вот вопрос Михаила. Тут, наверное,
Да, вопрос Михаила.
Можно озвучить, может быть, все как-то в чате напишут. Мне кажется, этот вопрос он вообще ко всем.
Да, вопрос у нас, наверное, такой будет последний сегодня. Есть ли у музейных коллективов проблема с перегруженностью от информационных потоков из-за того, что в работе работают онлайн очень много коллеги через чаты, через Facebook, через Zoom и так далее?
Yeah. So Zoom, I think Zoom can be a problem, and I think after when we start reflecting and having a chance to actually think about how work practices have changed so rapidly in the course of a year, we'll be able to reflect on that more. But yeah, I think it's made things easier in some ways, but much more difficult in other ways. And I think one of the problems, I don't know if I'm answering the question now, I think I'm going off, hello Kat, I'm going off on a tangent, but I think one of the problems that's happened with online work is that the blurring between life, home and work has become, they've become so interwoven. So we're sleeping, eating, working in the same space, and our computer might be in the room where we sleep, for example, and if you're being bullied and harassed at work, I think that makes it really, really difficult. Yeah. Thank you.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Александр, еще раз. Я думаю, мы будем заканчивать сегодняшнюю встречу. Огромное спасибо вам за интересную, содержательную и очень важную презентацию. Нам нужно еще время для того, чтобы осмыслить все то, о чем вы рассказали, и подумать о том, как это применимо к российскому опыту и чем презентация может быть полезна в российских музейных реалиях. Спасибо вам огромное. Я напомню всем, кто нас слушает сейчас, и тех, кто будет нас слушать в записи, что сегодня результатами исследования о буллинге в британских музеях с нами делилась Александра Вудл, музейный профессионал, преподаватель университета Шеффилда и инициатор и член проектной команды исследования, о котором сегодня шла речь. С нами сегодня были прекрасные переводчики, огромное вам спасибо за это, Татьяна Швец и Анастасия Лазаренко. Большое спасибо ИКОМ России за поддержку сегодняшней встречи, за информационную поддержку и вообще поддержку сегодняшней встречи. Поддержка, как мы выяснили, это очень важно. Приятно чувствовать плечо коллег и видеть улыбки на лицах. Я куратор проекта «Идеи для музеев». Аня Михайлова сейчас с нами тоже, с вами, со всеми попрощается. Огромное спасибо еще раз всем. Да.
Thank you very much. Спасибо.
Аня, ты скажешь 2 слова?
Да, я очень рада, что у нас состоялось такое международное сотрудничество. Я уверена, что опыт, который уже есть у Алекс как исследователя, у Музейной ассоциации, которая курировала исследования, поможет нам в следующих шагах. Мы тему благополучия собираемся развивать. И, конечно, хотелось бы, чтобы это было основано не только на каких-то наших ощущениях, предположениях и историях, которые мы знаем, а носило более системный характер. Поэтому мы, Алекс, будем к тебе обращаться за консультациями, если это возможно, разрабатывая наш собственный исследовательский проект. Вот.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for your brilliant questions as well.
Спасибо, коллеги. Тогда мы завершаем встречу. До встречи. Всего вам доброго и чтобы буллинга было поменьше в нашей жизни. Спасибо.
Все.